Sometimes the hardest part of faith isn't pain itself. It's not knowing why it's happening. You pray, you do your best, you try to live right, and still, things fall apart. Job's story doesn't start with failure or punishment. It starts with a good man living a faithful life, and everything being taken from him anyway. This isn't a story that rushes to comfort or easy answers. It stays in the uncertainty. It asks what faith looks like when God doesn't explain himself. And that's why Job's story from the Bible still matters. 1. Job starts with a life that makes sense. Job's story doesn't begin with loss or pain. It begins with stability. The Bible introduces him as a man living in the land of Uz. He is described as blameless and upright. That doesn't mean he is sinless. It means he lives with integrity. He fears God and turns away from evil on purpose. Job also has what most people would call a full life. The Bible gives great detail here. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Job 1:2-3. From the outside, everything adds up. Strong character, visible blessing, a stable life. That detail matters, because when things later fall apart, the Bible removes the easy explanation that Job somehow caused it. This is not a story about someone reaping bad choices. It begins by making one thing very clear. Job is doing everything right. And yet, his life is about to change in ways he cannot predict or control. 2. Faith before anything goes wrong. Before suffering enters the picture, we see how Job lives day to day. His children regularly gather and feast together. There's no tension hinted at, just normal family life. But Job is intentional. After each cycle of feasting, he rises early and offers burnt offerings for his children, not because he knows they've sinned, but because they might have. He says, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job 1:5. This tells us something important about Job. His faith isn't reactive. He doesn't wait for disaster to pray. He doesn't turn to God only when life feels unstable. Scripture says he does this continually, over and over again. Job's relationship with God exists in ordinary time, in quiet mornings, in routine obedience. That's important later, because when everything breaks, Job isn't encountering God for the first time. He's walking into suffering with a faith that already existed. 3. A conversation Job never knows about. Then the story shifts somewhere Job cannot see. Job 1:6-8. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" God brings up Job by name. He describes him the same way again: blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. The repetition is intentional. It removes doubt. What happens next is not because God overlooked something in Job. God doesn't just mention Job, he singles him out. That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Satan responds by questioning Job's motivation, not his behavior, his reason. He argues that Job fears God because life is protected, because God has put a hedge around him, because everything he does prospers. Here's the key part. Job never hears this. He never knows this conversation happens, and that mirrors real life more than we like to admit. Sometimes things change without explanation, without context, without access to the reasons behind them. If this story has kept you take a second to like the video and subscribe to Stick with God Now. These stories are meant to be sat with, not rushed through. 4. The question that changes everything. Now Satan's challenge is simple but unsettling. Job 1:9-12. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason?" In other words, would Job still trust God if the benefits disappeared? If the protection was removed? If life stopped making sense? Satan suggests that if Job loses what he has, his faith will collapse. That devotion is conditional, dependent on comfort. God responds without explaining himself. God allows the test, but he draws a line. Only upon himself do not stretch out your hand. That means Job's possessions can be touched, but Job himself cannot. That boundary matters. God does not lose control of the situation. Permission is given, but authority remains with him. Job, meanwhile, continues his ordinary day. He doesn't know what's been discussed. He doesn't know what's coming. And that's the tension of this story. Job's suffering won't come with an explanation. And neither does ours most of the time. That's what makes this story uncomfortable and honest. 5. Loss comes in waves, not all at once. The losses don't arrive slowly. They come stacked on top of each other. One messenger barely finishes speaking before another runs in. The Bible emphasizes this moment clearly. While he was yet speaking, first, the oxen and donkeys are taken. The servants are killed. I alone have escaped to tell you. Job 1:15. Before Job can respond, another arrives. The fire of God fell from heaven. The sheep are gone. More servants dead. Again, I alone have escaped. Job 1:16. Then another. The Chaldeans form 3 groups, raid the camels, and kill the servants. Same ending, same words. Job 1:17. And then comes the last message, the one that changes everything. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A great wind strikes the 4 corners. The house collapses. All 10 children are dead. Job 1:18-19. No pause, no space to breathe. Job doesn't lose one thing. He loses everything, his wealth, his work, his future, and his family in a single day. Sick Job's first response is not what you expect. The Bible is careful with what Job does next. He doesn't speak right away. He stands up, he tears his robe, he shaves his head. These are physical signs of grief, public, honest, ancient ways of saying something has broken. Then Job does something unexpected. He falls to the ground and he worships. Job 1:20. Not because he feels good, not because the pain is small, but because grief and faith are not opposites. They can exist in the same moment. Job finally speaks. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. These are not polished words. They don't explain anything. They don't resolve the pain. They simply acknowledge reality. Job does not pretend the loss didn't happen. He names it, and he does not deny God's authority over his life, even when that authority hurts. This response is why Job's story still matters. Faith here is not loud, it's restrained, and it's real. Quick question for you. Have you ever gone through a season where you felt God was testing your gratitude or your blessings? Drop it in the comments. Not to explain it away, just to be honest about it. 7. What Job does not do. Now comes a statement from the chapter that requires our full attention. Job 1:22. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That doesn't mean Job feels nothing. It doesn't mean questions won't come later. They will. The book of Job is full of them. But in this moment, Job does not accuse God of injustice. That distinction matters. Job doesn't say God is cruel. He doesn't say God is unfair. He doesn't pretend to understand what just happened. He simply refuses to turn his pain into blame. This is important for anyone watching this who thinks faith means silence or emotional suppression. It doesn't. Job grieves openly. He mourns physically. He speaks honestly. But he does not cross one line. He does not decide that suffering automatically means God is wrong. That kind of restraint is rare. And it's not weakness, it's trust without explanation. Job doesn't know about the conversation in heaven. He doesn't know about Satan's challenge. He only knows loss. And still, he holds his ground. 8. Why this story hits so close to home. Job never gets an explanation for this moment. Not then, not later. He doesn't hear God say, "Have you considered my servant Job?" He doesn't hear Satan ask, "Does Job fear God for no reason?" Job 1:8-9. All of that happens outside his awareness, and that's what makes this story so human, because most of us live on Job's side of the story. We experience the loss, the confusion, the sudden change, but not the reason. We're left asking why, with no answer in sight. Job's story doesn't tell us that suffering is good. It doesn't say pain is deserved. It simply shows us what faith looks like when understanding is absent. Not loud belief, not forced optimism, but a refusal to let confusion turn into bitterness. This is why Job's story isn't about having strong answers. It's about holding steady when answers don't come. And that's why it still resonates, because sooner or later, everyone ends up standing where Job stood. 9. The second conversation. Job still doesn't hear. After Job loses everything, the story shifts again, away from earth, back to heaven. And once more, Job has no idea this is happening. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and Satan comes with them. God brings up Job again. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Job 2:3. Satan responds with a new claim. Losing possessions wasn't enough, he argues. Skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. Job 2:4. In other words, Job still worships because his body is untouched. Then Satan says it plainly, stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Job 2:5. God allows the test, but again with limits. Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. Job 2:6. This moment matters because it shows something hard to accept. Sometimes suffering deepens, not because faith failed, but because it held. Job never hears this conversation. He doesn't know why the pain continues. He only feels the silence stretch longer. 10. When pain reaches the body. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job 2:7. Job sits among ashes. He takes a broken piece of pottery and scrapes his skin just to cope with the pain. This is not poetic suffering. It's uncomfortable, raw. Then someone close to him finally speaks. His wife says, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Job 2:9. It's not mockery, it's exhaustion. She's watching someone she loves suffer with no explanation. Job answers calmly, not angrily. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Job 2:10. The text is clear again. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job 2:10. He doesn't deny the pain, he doesn't minimize it, he simply refuses to let suffering redefine who God is. And at this point, the silence feels heavier than the pain itself. Job's story doesn't end with quick answers, and that's intentional. It reminds us that faith isn't built only when life makes sense. Sometimes it's formed in silence, confusion, and waiting. Job doesn't get clarity right away, but he keeps his integrity when everything else is stripped away. If this story connected with you, stay close to it. And stay here. On Stick with God Now, we walk through Scripture honestly, without shortcuts, without noise, learning how to trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing.